I presented earlier today to a trade organization on best practices for sourcing a managed security service provider, and I had a really good question. One of the attendees asked, how do you know if you need the service to begin with? And when I said, well, you need to start with a baseline. You need to establish where your security posture is currently, and then understand the level of risk your organization is willing to accept, and then understand what kind of gap there is between the two. And if the gap is substantial enough, then you engage with some kind of security provider outside of your organization to fill the gap. So a CIS audit is an audit by a third party that considers your environment against the CIS controls, the basic and foundational and operational controls that describe what a good security posture should look like. And that gives you great insights into your level of risk, into your security posture, and whether or not you need to have an MSSP engage with your company to improve that posture. I've seen estimates that there are 400 MSSPs around the country. It's a $96 billion industry that's projected to grow over $300 billion within the next 5 years. One of the constraints that's limiting that growth is the number of cybersecurity professionals who are available for hire. Effectively, there's a 0% unemployment rate, as 3.5 million cybersecurity roles went unfilled last year. Anyone intending to build out a security function internally will be challenged, as there are no people to hire and it is extremely expensive to set up an effective security operations center. This leads to explosive growth in MSSPs and a requirement for having people outside of your organization manage your security posture. So what is an MSSP? Well, an MSSP is a company that is invested in a security operations center, which is a group of individuals who work 24/7 monitoring their client's environment. They typically use a SIM technology or an XDR technology to gain access to that environment and be able to monitor and understand what's going on. And they may be engaged in threat hunting activities where they're actively poking around and checking the environment for any kind of intrusion. An MSSP or an MDR solution or an XDR solution, these are all critical for any kind of company that takes security seriously, because you really need that 24/7 support in order to keep your environment secure. I recently read that about 8% of companies were outsourcing security at the beginning of the year, but that 83% of CIOs were considering doing so by the end of the year. Now, that's a huge amount of growth, and it deserves some explanation. Why do people outsource cybersecurity? Well, there are two big driving factors. The first is that it is damn difficult to hire cybersecurity professionals. Effectively, they have a 0% unemployment rate, and retaining the talent can be quite difficult, as most of them leave after 18 to 24 months. That's on national average. The second reason is that building out a cybersecurity function through a security operations center is extremely expensive. Even a basic center costs about $1.5 million per year to run, and an advanced center can be upwards of $7 million. So only the largest companies can actually justify that kind of investment to secure their business. It makes much more sense to engage with a company that has made those investments and then fractionally own the capacity. Every MSSP offers a slightly different value proposition. Some companies have a more consultative approach with more access to senior talent, and that might fit for smaller organizations that need to have that kind of engagement from the vendor. Other MSSPs might operate at scale with huge security operations centers and well thought out and well developed and mature practices, and that might make more sense for larger organizations that can afford the cost and that also have a diverse set of assets that need to be secured. The challenge, of course, is making sure you're managing the vendor toward the reason you hired them. So if you make a decision to choose a vendor because you have access to senior talent, make sure that's in the agreement and is in the governance documentation so you get the value out of it that was intended. If you're hiring a vendor for better innovation, make sure the innovation is written into the agreement and that they're investing in the service so that you get what you're paid for and what you thought you were going to get when you signed the agreement. Third-party risk is disproportionate and asymmetrical. It's disproportionate because the size of the risk may be much larger than the size of the business you're doing with the vendor, and it's asymmetrical because that risk may have nothing at all to do with the kind of work that vendor is doing. Consider a small network vendor that for $3,000 is making some kind of change and needs admin credentials. But because of that admin access, they open you up to a third-party risk of a cyber attack that leads to, say, disclosure of all your employees' social security numbers. It's both disproportionate and asymmetrical. You manage the risk by thinking about the access that the vendor has, not thinking about the exact kind of work that they're doing for you. There are two big levers to consider when quantifying your exposure to risk. impact and probability. How impactful would it be if this risk event occurred? Meaning, would we go home for the day or would we go out of business? And probable, how likely is it this event would actually happen? So, for example, project delay is probably pretty likely. Most IT projects get delayed a little bit, but hopefully not very impactful to the business. Cybersecurity risk, otherwise, is hopefully less likely to happen if you put the right controls in place, but it's probably highly impactful. You want to spend most of your risk mitigation efforts on highly probable and highly impactful events and get that impact down below your risk appetite.